Neurodynamics is tension contentious. This came out in JMMT in 2021. At the end, it describes the background of the researchers here, the people who wrote this article, this review, and they all have a good mix of, research background and practice background, specifically with nerves. So it's a good author group here. There's going to be a lot of detail here that we can go over. I'm going to try to make it simple and hit the highlights. So it hits a little bit out strain here. It hits a little bit better later. So here early on, we're going to hit a lot of the science aspects. So peripheral nerves are nonlinear, viscoelastic responses to tensile loading. So it is important to understand that a little bit, so that way we understand what we're seeing when people are telling us what happens when we stretch their nerves and when they're having pain. Nonlinear means that it doesn't pull the same amount throughout all the motion. Obviously, we know that clinically it pulls a little bit more. It pulls more at the end. Viscoelastic means that it wants to pull it back towards where it started at. And there has to do with creep, that there's actually a change in the structure of it while it's pulling, and then they change back to where they were, and there is a pull there. And so that it goes over a lot of the other details here, but they do glide, they bend, they twist, the extracellular matrix helps. That we do understand a lot of the anatomy of nerves. Let's see here. Yeah, so this last thing, mechanical features allow nerves to straighten without bearing significant stresses while maintaining functional and structural integrity of the delicate axons within. So the human body is made to protect our nerves because they are delicate, but they're pretty resilient outside of there. The protective mechanisms are. And then here, so evidence from the Petri dish. So basically, again, we're not looking at human models here, but mechanical stimuli are fundamental for tissue healing. So we've got to stress it if the tissues are damaged. Mechanical load applied directly to nerves can activate intracellular processes responsible for nerve myelination and nerve homeostasis. And so then it goes into a lot of that, what they measure and everything. But mechanical loading is necessary. We see that all throughout the human bodies. We've got to stimulate it through loading. It's a lot of the details that you can read if you want, but one significant one is that the level of the dorsal root ganglion, tensioning techniques resulted in a decrease of substance P. Remember, substance P plays an important role in the development of chronic pain. So tensioning techniques can decrease the substance that does affect chronic pain. So here it is. It's starting to summarize the evidence from human trials. And it says it is impossible to isolate the effects of tensioning techniques, largely because there's multimodal treatment. We never just do that. But it does talk about how to decrease sciatic nerve stiffness. And what they did over 12 weeks, it was just over 5 minutes a day. It was like 5 1/3 minutes a day. That it did decrease the sciatic nerve tension. They went over a few of those type of studies. And wants to know, is it too much of a good thing that we can overdo it a little bit if we're too aggressive? But those were they held them there for a long time, so we don't need to be too worried there. But clinical reflections, this is where we're going to get some really good stuff. So it talks about here a little about the strains. It's good to have somewhat of an understanding, but the problem is that in live human subjects, we really don't know the strains very well because of the difficulties measuring it. But in animal and cadaveric studies is where we get a lot of our numbers, which means that that's sometimes why they vary so much. But if you want some numbers, especially if somebody asks you, bending forward, it's 10.5% strain. And then it's 12 to 13% in a straight leg raise. So we probably get a little bit more strain in straight leg raise than we do bending forward. but that's not solid research with live humans. And then I'd like to read a little bit here. Basic science studies revealed the potential working mechanisms of neurodynamic techniques. However, the translation of these findings to clinical recommendations remains challenging. All studies that use animal models to document the effects of tensioning techniques use nerve injury models that are much more severe than the neuropathies of people that we typically see. We're going to come back to the next part here in a little bit. And then here's a good summary statement of the research. Making evidence-based recommendations regarding the precise frequency and number of repetitions of neurodynamic techniques, including tensioning techniques, is problematic given the large variability reported in the literature. In the book A World of Hurt, I think they said 10 to 15 repetitions every 2 to 5 hours. That would put you at about that 5-minute mark that other study showed for the sciatic nerve. But there is a decent amount of art. We have parameters that have been used in research that was helpful, but we can't isolate that. We don't really know one parameter versus another, although we do have some guidelines as we've gone over here. Here's the conclusion. The research shows that repeated mechanical tension on animal peripheral nerves applied by tensioning techniques has positive effects on nerve biomechanics, nerve repair, and nerve regeneration processes, promoting multi-level changes in the peripheral and central nervous systems. So we have a classic role here where we have a lot of mechanistic studies, but how does that translate to humans who are in our clinics with pain? It says frequent reassessments continue to play an important role. This, what I highlighted in pink here, highlights what I see with my patients in the clinic. A selective lesion, so this is where they said that it is with the animal studies. A selective lesion to the nerve without damage to joints or intervertebral discs in animals are typically, and the animals are typically young without comorbidities. So if somebody has a lot of different issues, I don't find nerve tensioning techniques to be as helpful. They might be helpful multimodally, but it's tough to, there's normally a lot of other things that I'm working on. So if somebody has a major disc injury or a major back injury, we need to be focusing there at the beginning than distally. If they have diabetes or other comorbidities that are causing these nerve symptoms, nerve tensioning, nerve gliding techniques, I've found to have very little benefit. But if it's a selective lesion, so it's one nerve, to the nerve without damage to the joints or intervertebral discs, and they're a younger, healthier person, it's just this single nerve mononeuropathy, that's when these can be helpful. I do find that if there is a continuing lesion that it's not as helpful, and maybe that's just because it's slower. If we're dealing with pathoanatomy, that dictates prognosis. If we're just dealing with pain in a nerve and there's not pathoanatomy, then it improves somewhat quickly. And that is how I see it with patients, and it lines up with the mechanistic research that we see in the literature.